And when the British invaded in 1776, Bishop Robert Smith enlisted as a private in the South Carolina militia and stood shoulder to shoulder with his countrymen at the Battle of Sullivan's Island, which is the great strategic victory of the Revolution. It opens with a huge upset victory of the British Caribbean fleet. And it is believed that he is the only American rector of the Revolution to fire a gun at the British.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we're going to Charleston, and we're very excited to have Tommy Dew, the owner and operator of Tommy Dew's Walking Tours in Charleston. You can reach him at tommydewswalkingtours.com, and it's considered one of the top 5 city tours in Charleston and the top historic walking tour, according to Southern Living magazine. So welcome, Tommy.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
We are big fans here at Historyman of what you're doing down in Charleston, and we are following you on Facebook. You are giving us little tidbits of information about one of the oldest cities in the New World in the United States, and certainly it is renowned for its architecture and the history there. And we thank you for bringing it to life in social media. But the fact that you're doing a walking tour and have been for years is just really cool to me. And I know our listeners would love to visit you as they come by and celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution in Charleston. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very fortunate. I started giving tours 31 years ago, and I had an epiphany not too long ago that I've never had a bad day at work. It's just the most beautiful city. It's visually stimulating, and guests come from all over, and they're awe-inspired. It's more beautiful than advertised, but I think what really gets people is how impactful the city was. They know it's going to be pretty, but they don't understand how influential Charleston was. It's a bit of a forgotten history, and so it's a lot of fun for me to get to talk about that and reveal that to guests.
Well, I know that the history goes back to 1670, but we try to stay in the niche of the American Revolution. So tell me some stories about that era.
So my route every day, I start at the city market and I finish down at the High Battery. It's about a mile long walk, but that takes us right through the oldest part of the city and past any number of historic sites. And it's really a beautiful place to study the American Revolution. I think, for guests, that's one of the biggest surprises, how much happened here and how much sacrifice was required from South Carolina to establish independence from Great Britain. I think maybe the simplest little statistic is we're the bloodiest theater. About a third of the engagements, battles and skirmishes were in South Carolina, a third, and more people died in South Carolina than any other colony. And that's always a surprise. That opens eyes. And right where we walk, the historic district was the scene of really the greatest defeat of the American army. Charleston was bombed by the British. We were under siege for 6 weeks in the spring of 1780, and the fall of the city at the end of that is the single greatest defeat of the American army, 5,500 casualties. As your listeners know, that's killed, wounded, captured, and missing. So that's number one, 5,500. And the second place defeat for the American army during the Revolution was New York City. George Washington surrendered Brooklyn in New York in 1776, and that was 2,500 casualties. Since that's second place. So 5,500 was just catastrophic for the American side.
When you look at that, and it's hard to go into the city and see it flourishing like it is and imagine that being such a huge defeat at the founding of our country, and we were still not yet a country. That it was very much up in the air whether or not we would even win that war. And that was a very long war. And
it is. It was a long war. I think it was longer than people realize. And right. The British, they were here for 33 months. They occupied the city for almost 3 years, and it was an abusive campaign. One American said they occupy us with the insolent pride of conquerors. They were heavy-handed, and I think if they had played nice here, they could have potentially harnessed the locals, but they didn't, and it cost them. It built deep resentments, and over time, the locals made short work of them. And they very much regretted what they did here. It's been, I've heard one historian describe South Carolina as England's Vietnam. They did not know what to make of this place, and the local boys who were so angered by them and their behavior had a huge home court advantage, and used it to their full advantage, they warm out.
Yeah,
But
I find it interesting that Charleston really was a hotbed of a lot of the pushback. There was a lot of Liberty men there, led by Gadsden, Christopher Gadsden, the maker of the Gadsden flag that is so known. Uh,
I keep, just so you know, I have a key to the graveyard where he is buried, and I keep the Gadsden flag at his grave, and I walk past that almost every single tour. And it's the Marine Corps Burgee now. He gave that flag to the Navy, and it's now the Marine Corps Burgee. And if you get a Marine on the tour and they see that that's Chris Gadsden's grave, they can't even believe it. They get weak in the knees.
yeah,
People don't always remember that that's a South Carolina flag. They get it confused with so many others. There is a bit of a story there. The rattlesnake became the symbol of resistance starting in 1754. Ben Franklin would introduce it in 1754. He was angry because Great Britain was emptying prisons, and so trouble was arriving ship after ship. And Franklin said, if she continues this policy, I will return the favor by shipping a box of rattlesnakes to Parliament, to St. Paul's Church, to Buckingham Palace. And so, it's a fair swap, rattlesnakes for prisoners. And it ends up being this beautiful symbol of resistance because, one, you do not find them in England. From their perspective, it's this crazy New World animal. It's got a rattle on its tail, and it can kill you. But the other part that I think is so important is that the rattle indicates fair-mindedness. He was giving you a choice. The rattlesnake will coil and rattle to let you know he's there. And so you can either walk away and avoid the fight, or you can keep coming. And if you do, we're going to fight to the death. So it was this beautiful symbol of American resistance that first comes out in 1754. And then the American colonies will start to pick up on it. So New Hampshire, live free or die. Massachusetts, join or die. Rhode Island, we hang together or we hang alone. And I really like that one because I think that tells the story. The 13 colonies were so different. It's like herding butterflies. You got different nationalities, different religious sects, different weather, climate, resources. And so they were not exactly on the same page about everything. It was not necessarily this kumbaya moment. And the Rhode Island flag is a snake chopped into 13 pieces with a colonial name on each of the segments. And the gist of it is, if we break ranks against the most powerful nation in the world, she will chop us up and we will all die. So we have one crack at this. We can either hang together or we can hang alone. And then Gadsden's as well, don't tread on me. And so it's just this beautiful symbol that's going to unite the colonies.
well, tell me about Charleston. Give our listeners kind of an understanding of what Charleston looked like. My understanding is it was a walled city, and that was unique in the New World.
Well, there was a walled city in the beginning. So if you just to jump back, we were founded by England in the late 1600s. And for our revolutionary listeners, it did not become Great Britain until 1706. The United Kingdom was consolidated then. So we started as an English colony in an English city and become a British colony and city in 1706. It's just a little timeline issue related to the consolidation of the empire. We were named for Charles II. That's why we're called Carolina. The Latin word for Charles is Carolus. And so Carolina is a derivation of that. And then the first city would be named for him as well. And overnight, it was the fourth largest city in the American colonies and remained the fourth largest city in the United States into the 1790s. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Charleston. So those are your top four through the colonial period. And it's a contextual thing. It's kind of funny. In 1776, Philadelphia had 25,000, New York 20, Boston 15, and Charlestown 12,000. And those are the four largest U.S. cities at that time. And I think one of the things that makes the revolution fascinating here is the wealth. 9 of the 10 richest people in America were South Carolinians for a period of time before the revolution. 9 of the 10 richest people all at once, and they all lived in downtown Charleston. They educated more children in Europe than the other 12 colonies put together. And that's a huge statistic. People don't associate higher education with the Deep South. And I would argue it's because they weren't inclined to seek it locally. If you were an elite colonist, if you're an aspirational colonist, the one thing that you did not possess was title, and you would long for that. You would see the royals of Western Europe as the cool kids. So it was important for elite children to get back to Europe for education and seasoning. And South Carolina had the resources to get their kids abroad. They educated more children overseas than the other 12 colonies put together. And as you go north, it is humbler and it is increasingly religious. Religion will jumpstart higher education in early America. The Ivies were seminaries, all but Penn, which was Quaker. And as it works out, 8 of the 10 oldest universities in the United States are north of Washington, D.C. The only Southern schools in the top 10 in age are William and Mary and Washington and Lee, and they're both in Virginia. The College of Charleston, my alma mater, is the 13th oldest university in the U.S. It comes in right after Dartmouth. And so you've got a bunch of old schools in the North, and it's natural to assume that they're the most educated early Americans when in fact it was Charlestonians. But it wasn't well distributed education and wealth. It was an inner circle of landed aristocracy. The planter class was an inner circle of power and influence and prestige. And you have a limited middle class and then a large underclass of poor whites, yeoman farmers, and slaves.
So talk a little bit about the big names down there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's Middleton and the Haywards and the Manigos, and these are people that have extraordinary wealth and influence, and they had the most incredible lives, and that's what makes it so striking to me. These people are rich, they're English citizens in good standing, and they're comfortable, yet they're convicted. These people are going to put themselves in harm's way and do what they think is right, even though they are inclined to suffer. And that's one of the things about the revolution here that I find most interesting. These people are not going to benefit from revolution necessarily. There's an old saying, change is bad when you're number one. So aristocrats tend not to be revolutionaries. And in fact, the beginning here, the middle class and the lower classes drove the revolution. The dock workers, the mechanics party, they were suffering mightily because, as you know, in the 1760s, England introduces the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, and these are trade issues that deeply affect the viability of the waterfront, and the merchants and the dock workers and the ship's captains. It really harmed their ability to make money. For instance, Chris Gadsden, who you referenced, he was at the first Liberty Tree meeting in downtown Charleston in 1766, and it's this huge crowd of mechanics, dock workers, and he was the only aristocrat in the crowd. And he owned at that point the longest pier in British North America. Gadsden's wharf was over 800 feet long. It extended out in Charleston Harbor, and he owns this huge piece of Charleston's waterfront. Yet he is stepping into the fray. He's gonna become the head of the Sons of Liberty here, and he would be an American general here. And it's been argued, without Chris Gadsden, without him stepping up in the very beginning and bringing his resources to bear, we might not have won. He fueled the revolution in its infancy when it's going to be in the balance.
Well, it begs the question, why did these aristocrats who had contracts with England, who were very wealthy, and much of that wealth was because of their English ties, why did they decide to revolt?
Well, I think it's a spiritual and a philosophical question. I think these people were the world was changing, and a lot happened in the 300 years prior. Not to get too esoteric, but I think you look at the printing press that was invented in Gutenberg, Germany, and so what that's going to do is documents can now be mass produced, and in particular the Bible. And so they start translating the Bible in various languages. It used to be the Bible was a handwritten manuscript written in Latin. And you might have one Bible in a church and nobody knew what it meant. And all of a sudden, people are learning how to read and they're learning how to interpret the Bible, and they didn't see barriers to entry anymore. And you don't need a pope or the Vatican or cardinals telling you what to believe. You can read the Bible, and the faith piece becomes this very personal thing. There are no barriers to entry. And then that's going to lead to all these guys like John Locke and Hobbes who see these inalienable rights. Like John Locke wrote our Constitution for the colony of South Carolina. It's called the Carolina Charter. And Locke had said that the greatest gift from God was the ability to follow your conscience. Nothing can separate a man from his conscience. No government, no law. And so Locke is put in charge of writing our Constitution, and he gets to express himself, and he makes the very first law of the Carolina Charter freedom of conscience, which means the freedom to follow your conscience into faith, or freedom of religion. And so the very first law for the colony was freedom of religion, which will instantly inspire free thinkers to come to us. We're getting people that are leaving Europe because of what they believe. They're getting away from the Catholic Church on the continent of Europe, or they're getting away from the Church of England in the British Isles. And so these are people that are dropping everything that they have to cross the Atlantic, which is a brutal passage, and then land in a so-called wilderness because of what they believe. And so I think that sows the seeds for revolution another 100 years later. They're going to reject the Pope. They would then reject the king. And they would then, 80, 100 years after that, they would reject the federal government. So all these things are, I think, woven together. It's this notion that no one can tell me what to do on any front, whether it be religion or politics. And it's deep seated stuff, and it was baked in early.
So, if we were to take a walking tour in Charleston, what would be some of the
Well,
Revolutionary War things that we would see?
sure. So I think one of the guys that most interests me is Bishop Robert Smith. So a fascinating fact for me: in 1776, when the 13 colonies go into revolt, there are roughly 250 Anglican churches or chapels in the colonies, 250 distinct places of worship for the Church of England. Every one of those rectors was born in England. England refused to ordain American born boys into her priesthood, which is a profound layer of control. The king is giving all of our priests their jobs. And so when the revolution comes, 98 plus percent of the American rectors are Tories, they're loyalists. But Bishop Robert Smith, who was born in England, he's educated at Cambridge, he becomes the assistant rector of St. Philip's Church as a 23-year-old. It's the richest congregation parish in the colony, and it's the wealthiest colony. So it's an incredibly prestigious position. Within 3 years, he is the rector. And he would start to give fiery, treasonous sermons from the pulpit of St. Philip's in the 1760s. And when the British invaded in 1776, Bishop Robert Smith enlisted as a private in the South Carolina militia and stood shoulder to shoulder with his countrymen at the Battle of Sullivan's Island, which is the great strategic victory of the Revolution. It opens with a huge upset victory of the British Caribbean fleet, And it is believed that he is the only American rector of the Revolution to fire a gun at the British. So it's a man of the cloth, but he's doing what he thinks he needs to do to establish the greater good and put us on the right path. Once again, deep conviction. He would later be captured 4 years later when the British bombed the city and forced the surrender of Charleston. He helped prepare the defenses and he went into battle as well. He would later be captured. All the while, he's a private, one of the wealthiest men in the colony, but he's a humble servant and he's willing to be a private in the militia. And he would later be captured. And because he was prominent, he was offered parole, which basically means sign this piece of paper, swear your allegiance to the crown, that you'll never take up arms, speak ill of the crown again, and we'll let you go home. And Bishop Robert Smith said, quote, I would rather be hanged by the King of England than to later hang myself in shame and despair as Judas. So it's just the most beautiful quote. And this guy is willing to do whatever he has to do. And he knows that his term in prison is symbolic and he's not going to capitulate. He will not bend the knee. And I think it's profound. Just to add a little piece to that, he was buried behind the altar of St. Philip's. And the church would have a little fire near the altar in 1920. And they actually expanded the altar into the church, which is called the chancel. They added maybe 25 feet out into the graveyard, and they ended up covering the sarcophagus of Bishop Robert Smith. And it was so robustly built. It was such a beautiful piece of funerary art that the architect in 1920 said, let's just make this the foundation for the wall. So the arch of Bishop Robert Smith's grave sits under the altar at St. Philip's. The architect said, I can think of no finer base for the altar of this church than the grave of Bishop Robert Smith.
Wow.
It's a beautiful symbolism.
That's a great story. And I'm sure you have a whole bunch of other stories to go along with that tour. As we finish up here, let me ask you this, and this is a question I ask all of our guests. What does freedom mean to you?
Well, freedom's not easy, and I think one of the things I noticed, because I deal with so many people, I deal with people from every state and so many countries, and they have different personalities and they definitely have different perspectives. But I think one of the things we fail to realize is that freedom means not only the freedom to succeed, but it also means the freedom to fail. And I think that one of the things that we try to do is we try to mitigate all risks in this country. Life is about risk. Life is not easy, and we will have ups and downs. We will ebb and we will flow, but we just always must be pointed in the right direction. And if we continue to put one foot in front of the other and we acknowledge that we will succeed and we will fail, and that is part of life, that's what our founding fathers believed.
Well, I think that's fantastic. Tell us again, tell us about your tour. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So I've been a tour guide downtown for 31 years. I have done somewhere north of 15,000 tours in the historic district. I leave every day from the city market. It takes 2 hours. And I walked through the old walled city, which is the original fortress area of the city. But that was quite early. The wall started coming down in 1719. But that's sort of the romantic portion, the most romantic portion of the city, because it's right there in the core. And it had a wall around it, which, as you said, it's unique. St. Augustine had a wall, and that was a Spanish city. Quebec had a wall, that was a French city. But Charlestown was the only walled English city in North America. And and so we walk right through the heart of that over a 2 hour period. I consider it an overview. I try to give people a good framework, but we talk about everything, and I love questions. And so every tour is a little bit different than the last.
So is this a rain or shine type of event? How do people get a hold of you?
I would say typically, if it's a light rain, most people want to go because they spend a lot of money to get here and they're wanting to learn and see the place. And I've got a route that keeps us relatively dry. I can go station to station, get under awnings. I get into buildings too. I have access to some interesting stuff here and there. So we can usually fight through it. If it's pouring, we don't go. But as rainy as Charleston is, I don't lose many days a year to rain. Most of our hard rain comes in the afternoon, and I tend to walk in the mornings.
So how would people get a hold of you?
Sure. So I have a website, TommyDewsWalkingTour.com, and my name is DEW, Tommy Dew. And so you can email me. You can also call me. I've got a good number, 853-TOUR. So 843-853-TOUR, which is 8687. You can call me on that, send me a text or email me. And I go every day, almost rain or shine. I work north of 330 days a year. So I'm on the street every day.
So if I'm visiting Charleston, could I just show up at that corner and there
You
you'd
could
be?
show up at 11, but there's a possibility that I sell out. So it's
I
not a
say,
bad idea to call in advance and just make sure that the tour has room and running. I do a lot of private tours too. I lead the small groups around the city and I do a lot of theme tours. People will ask me to focus on architecture, focus on slavery, or focus on the American Revolution, or focus on gardening. So if people have a niche interest, I will do that on private tours.
well, I am very interested, and I know my wife is very interested in this type of stuff. So we look forward to visiting you here soon, and I hope our listeners do too. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you for what you do too. I think history is so important. We know. I think what we do is we maintain memories. We got to keep the memories alive, and we have to stay connected to the past. I think it makes us better people.
There are people who have a knack for storytelling. Okay, you have a gift. I think it's a divine gift, but you have that gift, and I'm sure people will love to be on your tour. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, sir. I'm very fortunate. I appreciate the opportunity to be on your show.